Hi, this is going to be a training on the federal grant monitor requirements for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 presented by the Vander Weele Group. In today's agenda, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 relief funding, give you an overview of the funding legislation and the framework that we have for monitoring and implementing these funds, monitoring requirements, reporting and record keeping requirements, and then give you some allowable cost examples on how to use the funding that has come out of the COVID-19 legislation. So let's talk about the three main pieces of legislation that we have. After the COVID-19 pandemic was declared by the federal government, Congress passed three pieces of legislation that were meant to help K through 12 education. The first one, CARES, was passed in March of 2020. The next one, CRRSA, was passed in December of 2020. And the final, most recent piece is ARPA, which was passed in March of 2021. All three pieces of legislation fund the Education Stabilization Fund, which is administered by the Department of Education. And within that ESF fund, there are three pots of money that go specifically for varying levels of education. You have the GEAR, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, the HERE, which is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, designated for higher education universities and institutions. And then the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER. And these are the funds that are designated primarily for K through 12 education. So let's talk about these. The CARES Act, which is the most common name given to these bills and these funds. It's the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act. And this piece of legislation establishes the framework for the authorized use of funds for not only the funding under the CARES Act, but the funding under all of the COVID-19 relief funding throughout the year. Originally, it was set to expire December 30th of 2020, but with the passing of CRRSA and ARPA and the implementation of the Tidings Amendment, the CARES Act funding actually now expires September 30th of 2022. And like I said, this is where the implementation and the creation of the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, or ESSER, was done. And this has become the major funding source for all public K through 12 schools related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's talk about the original rules governing the authorized use of ESSER funds. There are three major parameters that the federal government put on. One, the funds can only be used for costs that are necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency caused by coronavirus disease or COVID-19, that the expenses were not accounted for in the budget that were most recently approved as of March 27th, 2020, and that were incurred during the period of March 1st through December 30th. And as I said, that has actually been moved now with the Tidings Amendment. So this actually extended the period during which the expenses would qualify under coverage for the CARES Act. And this is actually the case for all of the legislation. The Tidings Amendment has been applied to CARES, CRRSA, and ARPA. So the expiration dates of the funding are CARES is September 30th, 2022, CRRSA is September 30th, 2023, and ARPA is September 30th, 2024. So the second legislation that was passed was the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations, or CRRSA. It increased funding to the Education and Stabilization Fund and created a separate funding stream called ESSER 2. It covered all of the existing allowable costs that were designated in ESSER 1, and then it expanded it by including a few things: funding to prevent learning loss for students, preparing for the reopening of schools, and one of the bigger ones was allowing funds to be used for testing, repairing, and upgrading the HVAC systems to improve air quality in school buildings. It's very rare for federal funds to be able to use for these kind of capital expenses. So this is especially important to note that this now for HVAC systems, this is an allowable cost with the school's federal dollars. And the last piece of legislation is the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. Again, increased funding to the Education Stabilization Fund, created a new funding stream called ESSER-3. Now, this piece of legislation was a little more restrictive. It did earmark that 20% of the funding had to go to counteract learning loss by students who missed school during the pandemic. It also came up with some funding for additional purposes, including that evidence-based interventions had to be applied for learning loss in summer enrichment programs, provided funding for after-school programs, focused a lot on mental health for K through 12 education, provided funding for non-public K through 12 schools through the GEAR funds, and allotted funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So let's talk about the legal framework that we have for these funds. One of the biggest ones is knowing that these federal dollars are under the guidance or under the guise of the federal uniform guidance. So these are the set of rules that are applicable to every federal dollar that comes in. And this is the primary legal authority for monitoring. Under the uniform guidance, one of the most applicable clauses is about subrecipients. When federal funds flow to other entities through a non-federal entity, the pass-through agency for schools, it would normally be the Department of Education, must monitor each subrecipient and its programs, functions, and activities. And one of the things that we want to talk about is that grants management is not the same thing as grants monitoring. When we're talking about grants management, that is talking about how dollars are spent, the best uses for them, if any guidelines or parameters need to be developed or implemented from the federal or state level. But grants monitoring is being able to make sure that the oversight of the strategy execution is compliant with all applicable federal rules, laws, and regulation. And here's a little more insight into that. It is for grants management is about the oversight, planning, and development of the grants process with a team to meet the needs of the grant recipient, but it does not play an active role in assessing how well those grant programs and grant dollars were compliant with the rules. So the grants monitoring is required under all federal and state guidelines. And I'll go ahead and let you look at this and read this. But I think it's important to note with monitoring is that it's not just about making sure that everything is compliant, but it's making sure that the programs, there's not any technical assistance or guidance that is needed. And if there is, making sure that that is provided. A lot of times people think that grants monitoring is about people coming in and telling you what you're doing wrong. But in reality, it's being able to say, okay, these are the parameters that we have. If we're not meeting them, let's go and figure out how we can meet them. Maybe it's a little more training. Maybe it's developing a corrective action plan. Maybe it's developing another plan of action that needs to be implemented at the state or the local level. That's what grants monitoring is all about. The framework of grants monitoring, there's actually not a clear definition of what monitoring has to look like. The flexibility in the federal regulations give the pass-through agency, in this case, Department of Education, the flexibility to how they develop their monitoring tools. They tell you that you have to do it, but they let you determine how you're going to do it for all of your federal dollars. There are a few mandatory components to it. It has to be risk and performance based. There has to be verification of not only programmatic, but fiscal reports, verification of audits. There has to be an incorporation of training and technical assistance to, again, make sure that folks understand what the regulations are and how they can be improved. And then, of course, on-site reviews, which a lot of them were paused during the pandemic. But gives the flexibility to be able for the pass-through agencies to say whether or not they want to continue on with on-site reviews. So one of the questions that I think often pass-through agencies and even the subrecipients have to ask is, why do we monitor it all? The main reason, it is the law. The uniform guidance is very clear that if a pass-through agency sends a federal dollar to another agency, they must monitor that subrecipient. And it is about to make sure that the funding and the programs are done with fidelity, that if there is any fraud, waste, or abuse that is occurring, that it's found and that it is corrected. And it's really about building trust within the framework of the taxpayers, within the framework of our community, to make sure that each of these governmental agencies and their subrecipients are working hard to make sure that the best use of the dollars is being spent for the benefit of as many people in the community or in your targeted population as possible. So when we talk about the subrecipient monitoring, these are some of the things that we have to do. And I've talked about them a little bit before, but we have to evaluate the subrecipient's risk. How likely are they to be non-compliant? Are there any red flags that the pass-through agency needs to be aware of? And then we need to monitor them and to make sure that we're looking at what are the terms and conditions of the specific federal dollars. For CARES, for CRRSA, for ARPA, is the expense being used in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Those are just some of the things that we have to look at when we're doing subrecipient monitoring. And when we're looking at the risk, we want to take a look at previous monitoring visits, previous audits. Do we have any new personnel or substantially changed systems? These are all suggestions that we would have for a risk assessment. But again, the actual framework for the subrecipient monitoring plan is up to the pass-through agency to determine. So let's talk about the COVID-19 relief funding monitoring requirements. And we're going to talk about three of the big ones. So we have to make sure that when any of our subrecipients receive COVID-19 relief funding from any of the sources, whether it's from GEAR, the Governor's Relief Fund, or the ESSER, or even the higher education, we need to make sure that they have adequate internal controls, that we have a monitoring plan in place, and that if for some reason they now become eligible for the Single Audit Act, that they ensure that happens. So internal controls are really important to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement objectives in some of the following categories. Looking at the effectiveness and the efficiency of operations, the reliability of reporting, the compliance with applicable laws and regulations. One of the things we often look for is this process to make sure that there's reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the following objectives. Do they have policies in place so that purchase orders are linked with invoices, which are then linked with payments for federally funded items? Are there policies and procedures in place that when an item is purchased, a large item is purchased with federal funds, that it is recorded in the inventory and that the agency is able to track that item, whether it's a computer or a piece of furniture or an HVAC system? All the parts are there. Making sure that subrecipients have these internal controls in place to make sure that there is accountability for the federal money that is being spent is not only required, but important to ensure that we have successful implementation of these funds. The other thing, like I mentioned before, the Single Audit Act, there are a lot of districts that, not only school districts, but individual schools or metropolitan areas that may not have received a grand total of $750,000 in federal funding before COVID. But with over $200 billion being pushed out from the federal government to local school districts, a lot of these districts and or schools or subrecipients have probably gone over this amount. And the minute they go past $750,000 in federal funding, during a fiscal year, so July 1st through June 30th, a single audit must be completed by an outside firm on the agency. And as the pass-through agency, you are required to ensure that this single audit was done, that it is submitted to you, and that it passes all of the regulatory compliance issues. So let's talk about monitoring requirements now. And I want to talk about 4 areas and give you some expectations for monitoring for staffing costs, supply purchases, equipment purchases, and contracted. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the reporting requirements. When the CARES Act was passed, it stated that any state educational agency receiving more than $150,000 must report on its use of the CARES funds on a quarterly basis. And of course, this also applied to CRRSA and ARPA. Luckily, there was already a available reporting system in place called the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, created the FFATA subaward reporting system. So each subrecipient through their own state local agency has to report on the use of the COVID-19 relief funding, which is then submitted to the state and then submitted to the federal government. It has luckily, being that this is an existing system, it hasn't been too much work for individual agencies, except that there is a lot of funding coming through. So I want to talk a little bit about the examples of internal control compliance documents, and I won't go through each of these, but I want to talk a little bit about some of them. So the 2 we have here are time and effort certification and cash management. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of state agencies and local districts and other subrecipients have known is that with federal funding, oftentimes when you have staff paid from the federal funding, they are either fully funded with the dollars, or if they're partially funded, you've got a time and effort certification policy and procedure in place. You have the ability to sit there and say, to document how many hours a staff member spent on this federal program versus either another federal program or other funded program. With COVID-19 relief funding, there has been a lot of instances of this funding going in and paying for partial salaries of staff that have never done time and effort certifications before. And so it is crucial that when any of this funding is paying for staff, that we have the policy procedure in place and we're able to monitor against that procedure and monitor the documents so that the staff time is properly tracked against the federal funds, including the COVID-19 relief funding. Equipment and real property management and procurement policy and procedure, talking about how we go out and purchase things using federal funds, and then what do we do when we receive that equipment. One of the examples that I've often used is the sheer amount of computers that have been purchased for school districts and local education agencies in the past year. When schools shut down and a lot of kids had to go to remote learning, a lot of them did not have computers that were capable of doing Zoom meetings or Power School or anything else. So the schools had to purchase them. Normally in a given year, you may have a school purchase 50 computers. Now they're on a scale of purchasing 500 computers. How do we go about making such a large purchase? How do we go about making sure that we got the best price? How do we go about making sure that when those 500 computers come in, that they're inventoried and tracked because they were all purchased with federal dollars? That's the importance of having these policies and procedures in place to make sure that we have accountability and a tracking system that can, again, ensure that the federal dollars are being spent to the best of their abilities. And here we talk about the same thing I just talked about with fiscal, 2 other procedures with that: fiscal management and purchasing procedures, and then the inventory procedures that are needed. For the cost, 2 more: cost allocation plan and the record retention and management. one of the things that I know a lot of schools have had issues with is making sure that they are truly accounting for all of their costs associated. And again, a lot of these folks that are now federally funded or even partially funded have never been funded before with federal dollars. So making sure that the true cost of the program is captured and then billed or invoiced under these funds is going to be an important part of the monitoring process. So let's talk a little bit about allowable cost. One of the best things that I read came from the CARES Act. And to me, it's very short, simple, and has helped me in my monitoring positions to review the COVID-19 relief fund. So the allowable costs are those that prevent the spread of COVID-19, prepare for COVID-19 and its impact on students, teachers, and schools, and then respond to COVID-19. Here are the fundable activities under ESSER with this legislation. And a lot of it is, I'm sure, very well known to most of you, but any activity authorized by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. So these are the programs Title I, Title II, IDA, Carl Perkins, as long as they meet the criteria of, again, preparing, responding, preventing COVID, and fall under any of the ESSA Act allowable activities, you can charge them to the COVID-19 relief funds. Coordinating a district's preparedness and response efforts with other agencies and health departments, providing school leaders with necessary resources to address the needs of the school. Both of those are very flexible in their understanding, but again, as long as it is to prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID-19. Addressing the needs of specific populations, such as low-income families or children with disabilities, developing and implementing systems and procedures to improve the preparedness and response of LEAs, any training and professional development of LEA staff on sanitation, minimizing disease spread. All of these are allowable under the COVID-19 relief legislation. Purchasing sanitation supplies for LEA facilities. All of the hand sanitizer and wipes that I'm sure most LEAs have either purchased or are purchasing on an ongoing basis are covered under these funds. Planning for and coordinating during long-term school closures, including technology and meal services. Purchasing educational technology, including assistive technology or adaptive equipment for those children with special needs that may need it. Providing mental health services and supports. Planning and implementing education after school and during summer. And then, of course, the broadest category, other necessary activities to continue providing educational services, including activities to maintain the operation and continuity of services and continuing to employ existing staff of the LEAs. These are the 12 main points created under the CARES Act for ESSER funding. All 12 of these points and all 12 of these allowable costs continue on throughout CRRSA and ARPA. So the 200 plus billion dollars that has been provided is available for these primary activities. So let's go through an example of some monitoring of allowable expenses that we would need to do. So an LEA has decided to have each school designate a fourth grade teacher to take on an additional responsibility of developing a remote learning curriculum for the solar system lesson planning. The LEA expects these additional duties to take about 10 hours a week above and beyond their normal teaching duties. The LEA will seek reimbursement for the additional 10 hours a week paid through a stipend to the staff member through the ESSER-1 awarded funds. So what policies would be required? The biggest one is the staff stipend policy, making sure that you have a policy in place that talks about how do you decide who gets a staff stipend? What are the qualifications? Often staff stipends have to be for work above and beyond their normal pay and above and beyond their normal workday. Most of it has to happen before school, after school, or even on the weekends. For the documents of what we would need to see in a monitoring visit, you would need to see the executed stipend agreement between the LEA and the staff member, really laying out what new roles and responsibilities the staff member is going to be taking on, how much compensation the staff member is going to be getting, and that it's signed by both parties. Copies of pay stubs that document stipend payment, and then budget tracking documents showing the cost versus the budget for the ESSER-1 funds. Here's another example. Same scenario as we had in the past, as we had with the example that we just went over, except this time the 10 hours a week are not going to be above and beyond what the staff member is doing, but will be within the workday of the LEA. I'm sorry, within the workday of the fourth grade teacher. So for 10 hours that week, instead of teaching fourth grade, that staff member is going to focus on developing the remote learning curriculum for the solar system lesson plan. So this is where the time and effort certification policy and procedure comes into place. Most of your traditional grade level teachers are not going to be funded with federal dollars. They're going to be either state or local dollars that come in. So they're not used to doing a time and effort sheet that shows in their 7.5-hour day, they had to spend 1 hour on this remote lesson planning. But now they do. So you've got to have the policy in place that shows how they capture that, the documents that they captured on, who signs off on it, where the documentation is kept, and then you actually have to verify that the time and effort sheets were done. This is part of the documentation that we need. The copies of the time and effort for every pay period that the LEA is seeking reimbursement for, the copies of pay stubs that document hours paid, and then of course the budget tracking documents that show the cost versus the budget for the ESSER funds. Another example is an LEA needs to purchase items for a student to attend school via remote learning. The school purchases a puzzle, body part toy, and sorting game for the student whose individualized education plan, or IEP, contains goals and objectives that can only be accomplished with these items. So what policies do you need? Oftentimes, IDA is a federal funding source, and a lot of schools receive that funding. But with the expansion of what can be covered under COVID-19, you have a lot more purchases being made, a lot more staff that can be covered under these funds. So you've got to make sure that you have the fiscal management and purchasing procedures, one that also references micro purchases, of how you're going to go out and find these items for purchase, make sure that you're getting the best price, and being able to go out and purchase them. Now, these policies and procedures are the autonomy of the governing board. They can make sure that they can put whatever they want in how they do the purchases and what limitations they put on there. However, as the pass-through agency and as the monitor, we have to make sure that the districts and or schools are adhering to that policy that was approved by the governing board. So what documents would we need for a monitoring visit? The number of quotes received according to the procurement policy, if that is required, a copy of the invoice for items, proof of delivery, a copy of payment for the items. We need a copy of an executed agreement showing the loan of the items to the student and or the student families. These are all items purchased with federal dollars. Either the policy needs to be that the student will be able to keep them at the end of school, or they need to be returned to the class. And then of course, the budget tracking documents for how much was spent from the ESSER funds. So let's just talk for one quick second about the critical components of CARES, CRRSA, and ARPA. So like I said, the guiding force for allowable causes for all of these are the framework is all the same. CRRSA and ARPA add a little bit, but the big difference between this and other federal funding sources, when you get another federal funding source such as Title I is Title I. It's tracked. You may have to differentiate when a fiscal year ends, but everything is under Title I. For these COVID-19 relief legislation and the funding that goes with it, all funding sources must be tracked and maintained separately, even though the allowable uses overlap. So you have to track anything against ESSER-1, ESSER-2, and ESSER-3. You may have a purchase of a body part toy for an IDA student that you choose to fund with ESSER-1. It has to be tracked against that funding source. 2 months later, you may have one that has to be tracked under ESSER-2 because you've run out of ESSER-1. You have to track it against ESSER-2. And the same thing with the GEAR funds, the Governor's Emergency Relief Funds. You have to track it separately for 1 and 2. It has definitely, having to track that is a lot of work on schools and on districts, but that is how the legislation was created, and unfortunately has to be one of the components of monitoring. And I should say that every single one of those funding sources has to be monitored separately. So when a pass-through agency is going out, they cannot just go out and say, we're going to monitor COVID-19 relief funds. The monitoring has to happen for ESSER-1 and ESSER-2 and ESSER-3 and GEAR 1 and GEAR 2. So a lot of work, although I know a lot of the districts and its leaders are probably very grateful for the amount of money that has come through these pieces of legislation, but it has definitely increased the workload on schools, districts, LEAs, and state agencies. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and wish you all the best of luck in monitoring and pursuing the COVID-19 relief funding.